Thank you very much, Alison, and it's my pleasure and honour to chair this fringe meeting this evening. I'm Sarah Ludford. I'm a Liberal Democrat here, member of the House of Lords, done a few other things in my life as well. But we are delighted to be holding this third fringe meeting. We also have a stall for Liberal Voice for Women at this conference. So around it, but to be work in progress. I have the honour to be president of Liberal Voice for Women, but all the work is of course done by Zoe, and Juliet, and Alison, and Helen, and Judith, and others. So I'm very privileged to do this. Anyway, it's as you know, because that's why you're here. This event is called "Can We Talk?" So it's a sort of double entendre slightly as a question, because there is a bit of a crisis of freedom of speech, and the one we're focusing on is that in universities, in academia. So our three experts this evening will talk about that. It's not only in universities, of course, it's in broader liberal society. Our three speakers are Helen Joyce, Almut Gadow, and Lara, Favaro, all of them with personal experience and expertise to share. So, as you, because you're at a liberal event, and you, like me, and Liberal Voice for Women, believe that the issue of free speech and academic freedom brings together two topics that are absolutely fundamental to liberalism, which is freedom of belief and freedom of expression. And we've always thought of universities as bastions of free thought. What's the point of going to university if you don't want to enjoy a place where new ideas can emerge and notions can be challenged, received wisdom can be discussed? But unfortunately, we've seen a lot of instances of censorship in recent years. So into that, the previous government introduced the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, which became an act. I personally am not anything of an expert on it, so Helen is going to tell us all about what it has. But anyway, its provisions would be broadly about enabling academics to exercise free speech rights under both human rights law and education law. However, days before it was due to come into force, the new Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, said she had decided to, quote, stop further commencement of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 in order to consider options, including its repeal. So this act is known as HEFOSA, or HEFOSA in the jargon. And so first up to talk about whether it's important, what's going wrong in our universities is Helen Joyce, former journalist, most latterly Britain editor of The Economist. She is an author, she's director of the human rights charity Sex Matters, and her first book, Transgender Identity and the New Battle for Women's Rights, was an instant bestseller. Helen,
So I'm going to start by telling you a personal story about my experience of free speech or lack of on campus. And I'll use that as a way to explain what HEFOSA would have done and why we needed it. So about 2 years ago, a little bit less, I was invited to speak at an event at King's College, Cambridge. I must say this event was specifically meant to test whether there was free speech on campus, specifically at Cambridge. I was invited by Arif Ahmed, who at the time was a philosopher, a fellow of King's, and he asked his friend Sir Parvat Dasgupta to be a sort of interviewer of me. And he did what happens certainly hundreds and maybe thousands of times a year at campuses, at colleges in Cambridge, which is a difficult job. You don't have to ask permission, you just book a room. And he then went to use the university, or specifically the college, email list, which goes to all students and academics in the college to say that this was happening. And what happened was very instructive. The master of the college and the senior tutor, the two of the most senior people in Keys, sent around an email to all the staff and students saying that I was offensive, insulting, and hateful. And they said that they both worked hard to make Keys an inclusive, diverse and welcoming home for our students, staff and fellows, and that this event would not contribute to the same. And they refused to let RF use the usual email publicity. And then about 48 hours before the event, they suddenly insisted that it be ticketed, which of course really threw a spanner in the works, because people had thought they were coming, but they didn't know that it was going to be ticketed, and we really didn't know about it. And at the same time, the Students' Union and various people at the college were saying they would organise a protest. They're very entitled to protest, that's fine. But they were saying it in a very intimidating way, and students were coming and telling Arif privately that they were afraid to come. And so Arif booked another room in Keys, quite near the room where the lecture was on, and he said to people that they could come from up to 3 hours early if they wanted, and kind of hide in this room and come in the back entrance to the event. I came very early too. So, you know, on the day it was kind of like mostly harmless. There was a protest. They never do their homework. I walked past it. They had no idea what I was. We did the event, and you know, kids turned up draped in the trans flag. That's fine. They can wear their flags. They asked questions. It's still the one and only event I've ever been at where people who completely disagree with me turned up and mostly sat quietly and asked questions and listened to the answers. But the protest got very nasty, actually, and some people broke away from it and made it into the college and came around the back and started banging so loudly on the doors that parts of the event we were not able to be heard. Well, at the time when I saw the letter to the staff and students at Keys, I wrote an open letter to Pippa and Andrew. And I said to them that I'm very used to this. I'm very used to people who make a show of defending free speech and open debate, because that's how their letter started. Their letter started with pabulum about, you know, free speech is wonderful, academic freedom is wonderful, and then there's the however. You know, I call it the free speech, but there's a bit in Game of Thrones where someone says ignore everything before but, and my God, it's true. And I said to them, do you remember the moment when, in 1984, when Winston cries out under torture, do it to Julia? So I think that they were saying do it to Julia, they were saying they're afraid of their students. They want people to kick me so that they don't kick them. Because actually I'm just a really very ordinary person. Like, what I believe is what everybody believed until about half a second ago, which is that humans are mammals who evolved, and that, you know, men and women are different things, mostly the same, but sometimes different, and that sometimes if you want to protect everybody's rights, you have to notice the differences. And the way that difference works is that if you ignore it, it's better for the people who are more powerful and worse for the people who are less powerful. So when you ignore differences, it's harder for people who are disabled. It's harder for women. It's harder for children. It's harder for gay people. It's harder for people who are in the job of the less privileged. And yet that's what we're doing, and we're calling it feminism, and we're calling it liberality. Well, the event went ahead, but shortly after that, Arif, who thought it might be the first of many, ended up leaving Cambridge, and he took the job of Director of Free Speech at the Office for Students. And I hadn't really been paying attention to what the law might be. I just knew that I had to sit and take it. I had no recourse for being basically defamed by these two people who were being paid a pretty decent salary to stand up for free speech and academic freedom, but instead did what they did. But as soon as Arif was appointed to that job, I knew that this was important. Like, whatever the details of this law, which was being shepherded through at the time, would be, if he was going to be the director in charge of it, it was going to be good. And it was a very difficult passage. It bounced around a lot. Clauses went in and out, because actually VCs, vice chancellors, are quite a strong lobby. And I don't think I'm saying anything unfair to them to say that they don't care very much for things that interfere with how they run their fiefdoms. Like, that's not really anything unusual about them. I mean, it's a bit like saying the institute directors don't want new regulations. It doesn't matter whether they're good or bad or different, they just don't want them. Like, VCs don't want anything that bites on universities. So there was a lot of horse trading and a lot of arguing, and in the end it passed. And the people I know, the many people I know who've had problems with free speech on campus, their only real criticism of it was that it didn't go far enough. But they recognised that it had been very, very hard to get past, and it was better than nothing. So I don't have to go into detail about what it did, because basically what it did is it gave universities existing obligations teeth. Since the mid-1980s, the law about universities has said that it is a fundamental duty on them to protect free speech. And there's an enormous and very well worked out sort of framework of free speech, because that's a qualified right. We don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded room. We don't have the right to defame people, to steal intellectual property. It's a balancing right, and freedom of speech sometimes collides in particular with privacy. But that's all kind of worked out in our courts. It's all there in the Human Rights Act and in the case law. But universities have to defend free speech on campus within the law, but they won't. And when they didn't, there was nothing that I could do. There was nobody I could turn to. So I could have turned to the Office for Students if this law had passed at that point, because every university would have had to write its plan for how it was going to defend free speech. It would have to lodge that at the OFS, and if there were any failures to do so, people could complain, and then the OFS could insist on a remedy. For example, they could have said, well, have a back, have another event, have a series of events, whatever. So I couldn't do anything about it, even though, it was professionally and personally very consequential for me. It's not nice having people call you offensive, insulting, and hateful. And, that appears if people search me. I don't know if it's on my Wikipedia page at the moment, which it was for a while. And it becomes part of the narrative about you that, there's no smoke without fire, there's nobody calling you these things unless you must have done something terrible. People don't check what I actually said. This is true. And then, as Sarah said, it was all dumped 6 days before it was meant to come into force. So I know from experience that people who want to say that things like this don't happen, they tend to start by saying, that there isn't a problem. Like, campuses are fine, there's nothing bad happening. And so I tell the world that this happened to me. And I say to them, you don't know that you're in a prison because you haven't tried to. You haven't come up against the bars. You haven't tried to say anything that people don't want you to say. It's only when you say things that people don't want to say that you discover whether you have free speech or not. And I know that I didn't. So then I give them my example and they say, well, it's not very many. And I find myself in a position of having to try to prove a negative. And I can just, you can believe me or not believe me, but I can tell you that when you become known as somebody who says things that people get bullied for saying, other people get in touch with you to tell you their stories. And I hear a lot of them. And I hear a lot of them from academics and from people in jobs like government departments. So my colleague Maya Forstater, our CEO at Sex Matters, and I often go to meetings in Westminster, and when we get out of the tube together, like most days, somebody will go, oh, good on you, keep going, keep doing it. And if we have a couple of minutes, we'll stop and say, well, what do you do? And very often, of course, they work in a government department. So this happened to me on Wednesday, and the woman worked in a big government department. And we said to her, oh, do you know about the SENE networks, the Sex, Equity and Equality networks? And there's one in the civil service, and it's got more than 800 members, and they are trying to get the same sort of response for women or men who are gender critical in the jargon as the LGBT network gets. And she looked kind of sheepish, and she said, oh, I think that's very difficult. Like, I'm worried that I'll get marked as a troublemaker. And Maya and I just have to sort of smile and say, well, when you think you're safe, do join. Something I didn't know about academia is that it's the most hard-line and conformist workplace imaginable. I wanted to be an academic myself. I have a PhD in mathematics, and I did 3 years postdoc, and that was what I'd intended to try to be. And I'm so glad that it didn't work out. I thank my lucky stars every day that I left and moved across into journalism at The Economist, even though academia had been my dream. So I said that I wasn't able to get satisfaction from Pips and Andrew, as I've thought of them ever since. They were very infantilising, and obviously not loud enough. Yeah. The way they talked to their students was very infantilising. I often, ever since I've thought of them as like CBeebies presenters, Pips and Andrew.
Thank you.
But what matters isn't that I wasn't able to get satisfaction. What matters is the other end of free speech. It's actually free listening. Like, I don't like being silenced, but it's more important that people can't hear what I was trying to say. Because free speech is actually the nearest we found to a magic recipe for progress. Anyone who's read the philosopher Daniel Dennett talking about evolution talks about things that are cranes, not skyhooks. So a skyhook is like, a god comes and makes a special creation, and a crane is like evolution, the process whereby natural selection makes things gradually better. Free speech is like that. It's a crane, not a skyhook. So some people think that they can tell us what things are safe or good to say and what things aren't. But those of us who trust in free speech recognise that much speech will be rubbish, it'll be wrong, it'll be overturned in the future, but it's the nearest we have to something like natural selection for ideas. So there's a rearguard action now to try to rescue HEFOSA, and various things are happening. The most meaningful recently was that 7 Nobel Prize winners added their name to an open letter in support of it. I'm going to finish by giving you one example of the sort of thing I mean when I say that it's a crane rather than a skyhook. So I started looking into trans issues in 2017, and it didn't take me long to realise that what was happening in gender clinics is a horror show. And when I put the word out, I was quickly introduced to a clinician who worked at one of them, and we met. She emailed me on a throwaway account, and we met at a pub very far away from where she lived, and I still don't know where that is. And she said she was leaving and she was going into private practice, not working in gender issues, because she couldn't square with her conscience anymore what she was doing, and she hadn't managed to get anywhere with complaints. So that was 7 years ago. I tried to write about it. I found it very hard to find anywhere to write about it. I found it hard to get an agent. I found it hard to get a publisher. No audiobook company would produce my book. My son ended up recording it at home in our understairs cupboard. And so on and so forth. It's everything that I did. It's like that thing that Ginger Rogers said about Fred Astaire, that she did all the same things in high heels and backwards. It was just so hard. Well, everything that woman told me in 2017 was vindicated in the Cass report published in April. That report shouldn't have been necessary. And it was 7 years after I knew about it, and a lot longer after some other people knew about it. So in that 7 years, and in that longer period, a lot of children were harmed, especially children who were going to grow up gay, especially children who were autistic, especially children who were abused or depressed or anxious. And those children have been harmed, and many of them have been harmed for life. And that happened because people weren't able to speak, and because it was so unreasonably difficult to get that message out. And one of the places it was very hard to get it out was on university campuses. So that's why that bill matters, and it's why it matters that people keep talking. Thank you.
Great, Helen, a fantastic start to the meeting. I should have explained the format, which is that each of the speakers is going to speak before we turn it over at the end to questions from the floor. But I get privileged between the speakers to toss a question to each one of them. So before we move on to Almut, Helen, could I ask you first of all, where is the pressure coming from to not implement the Act? And perhaps I could wrap that up with asking, were there is speculation or that one of the pretexts for trying to stall it is that the Act would lead to an increase in anti-Semitism on campus? Could you tell us what what your understanding is, what's going on?
I think the pressure comes from the fact that it was not a very popular bill. Like, the people who didn't want it were never really reconciled to it, and they could see that there was a likely change of government, so they just started working on trying to get rid of it as soon as they thought they knew who they would have as an interlocutor, as soon as they knew that Bridget Phillipson was the right person to talk to. And, she wasn't committed to it, I presume. I don't know any real inside information on that. I'm pretty sure she had VCs coming and visiting her and saying that we're going to be losing money soon. Universities are really in a bad situation financially. And so she was just, maybe, I don't want to say this about her personally because I don't know her personally, but it's a fact that nobody in this government has been in power since before 2010. So you're maybe not very ready to know that, look, this is what it's like. People turn up. The institute directors turn up and complain about environmental regulation, and you just got to be a bit cynical. And the same for everybody else who turns up. So I think she just kind of fell for it. So yeah, they found a mark and they got through. And then the anti-Semitism thing. So there's, as I said, there's a very worked out framework of free speech, and within that, Holocaust denial in particular is not capable of being protected as free speech. There's a specific carve out. So if somebody loses their job for denying the Holocaust happened, they can't turn to the protections for freedom of belief. It's out with them. So, and then there are many other things that are not protected. Harassment isn't, threats aren't. Universities can balance the smooth running of the, they don't have to let everybody onto campus to give everything they want. All of that pre-exists. Like I say, HEFOSA was only about giving teeth to the pre-existing law, the pre-existing framework. But I mean, the fact is that people went and said that to Bridget Phillipson and she believed it. So there are a group of Jewish academics who are writing to her at the moment saying, free speech has historically been pretty damn good for Jews. Like I say, free speech is always and everywhere the tool of the underdog. It's the people who don't get heard. Free speech was what Martin Luther King wanted. It's what the suffragettes wanted. So the idea that people who are under so much pressure on campus at the moment don't want to be able to speak, I don't think that their own voices matter too. It's just a bit madness. Yeah. However she fell for it.
Right. Okay, so it's watch this space, and we will learn more as time goes on. So anyway, I'm going to move on then to our next speaker, Almut Gadow. Almut is a Peruvian qualified lawyer. Doesn't mean she's Peruvian, but she's Peruvian qualified.
What's that, Peruvian?
Oh, sorry.
I am a national Peruvian.
Okay, right. Anyway, she's a lawyer and linguist, and she taught law at the Open University for almost 10 years, but she was dismissed for questioning new requirements to indoctrinate students in gender identity theory in ways which, in her view, understandably, were inappropriate and distorted equality law. And so she's currently bringing an employment tribunal claim against the Open University, and we know there have been at least one successful one, and others perhaps ongoing. Joe Phoenix with Open University.
Oh, we've got a problem in the room. It's just settled.
Oh, right, okay. Anyway, Almut hopes the judgment will clarify the right to academic freedom that human rights law already implies into every academic's employment contract. So, Almut, in 12 minutes, please. What's going on with you, or your view of the situation?
I'll do my best to keep the time. And thank you for the invitation to speak about my case this evening, about my case and the wider legal implication that Sarah's already mentioned now. What I'm going to say about the wider significance of my employment tribunal case against the Open University actually in some ways follows on quite nicely. So my points about the legal significance of my case actually in some ways follow on quite directly from what Helen has just been saying about HEFOSA and the need for an effective enforcement mechanism for academic freedom on English campuses. And Helen has mentioned just now the political backdrop to the free speech crisis that we're having on our university campuses, of the stark reality is that the loss of academic freedom that we're seeing is just not compatible with the fundamental rights of people who are affected by it, like Helen, like me, like Lara. And the new government that has just come in is evidently not minded to do anything about it. If anything, they are in the process of rolling back the safeguards for academic freedom that had already been brought in. So we need our universities to have that academic freedom for them to be fully fit for purpose. We need that there to be enforceable mechanisms so people can enforce their right to academic free speech against university authorities. And that isn't the case at the moment. The bad news is that the current government isn't going to do anything about it. During the current parliament, we're not going to see any new laws for us to protect free speech. The better news here is that parliament is not our only option. We have two ways of making law in this country. We have legislation passed by parliament, and we also have case law, of course, made by our courts. And the idea of going into the courts to ask the courts, not parliament, to confirm our right to speak. Can we talk the theme of this is perhaps an idea that gender feminists and all people will be really very familiar with. So perhaps I've come to the right meeting to talk about my case. because all the progress that we've seen in relation to the protection for gender critical feminists to hold their beliefs and to express their beliefs are gains that we've achieved through the courts, not through Parliament. If Turn Ireland is a better place to express gender critical views than some other countries, that is purely the result of strategic litigation that has gone on in this country. And by strategic litigation, I mean social movements choosing cases in which they can test particular points of law and get the courts to clarify particular points of law. So in relation to being gender critical, my understanding is that there were some feminist lawyers that had thought through the law and were quite convinced that existing equality law already protected those gender critical beliefs on the basis of the Equality Act as it was at the time. And then they almost waited and looked out for a case to come along in which they could put that argument before the court so that the court or tribunal could confirm that that is indeed the correct reading of the Equality Act as Parliament had passed it. That case that came along in the form of my HEFOSA being dismissed for expressing her gender critical views. And then fair dismissal claim was brought in the name of the my HEFOSA, and that argument was then put before an employment tribunal. Eventually the Employment Appeal Tribunal agreed with that argument and agreed with the idea that being gender critical is a philosophical belief within the meaning of the Equality Act. They agreed that if it is a protected belief under the Equality Act, that means that by definition my enforcer have the right to not be discriminated against for holding and expressing gender critical views, and she had a right not to be harassed for it. So that one test case, strategically brought, has given us the rule enforced data, the legal protection for gender critical views, and all the subsequent gender critical cases that have come along since. We've seen quite a run of successful cases since. They've really all been riding on the case. They've all been riding on the coattails of forced data. They've clarified the law a bit further around the edges, but in essence, the strategic litigation enforced that. I did all the heavy lifting, taking the whole issue of whether gender critical beliefs are protected under the Equality law to a tribunal and walking them through and getting the judges to map out that uncharted legal territory. That is what we achieved by bringing a test case. And so we've had that for gender critical beliefs. We now need a test case like that really for academic freedom. And we're hoping that in essence that we're going to achieve that with Gadow versus Open University with my case. The basic facts of my case are uncomplicated and they've already been summarised quite nicely. I've told the story so many times that I always assume everybody knows about it. But I was sacked for questioning the requirement to help liberate the curriculum by teaching gender identity criminal law module. By that point, I'd been teaching law at the university for quite a few years. I was employed on a permanent contract. And law school management then decided they were going to liberate the curriculum. And by liberating the curriculum, they essentially meant that we were going to be using the teaching of law as a vehicle to promote certain worldviews. And I questioned that. I questioned that in various contexts, but according to my managers, I went beyond the pale, specifically when I questioned why I had to teach gender identity belief on a criminal law module. So I asked them to explain the logic behind it. I asked them to define and explain some of the core concepts of what I was now required to teach in my tutorials. I asked if it was actually relevant to the teaching of criminal law. I asked if it was appropriate, given that some of my students might not believe in it. I asked if it was lawful to require my students to practice believing gender identity in my code. I drew out some of the implications of just accepting offenders' self-described gender at face value in the specific context of criminal justice. And my manager's response to all of that was just no debate. They just refused point blank to engage in any kind of discussion of the ideas that they were expecting me at the same time to teach in my law tutorial. Eventually, come the end of that academic year, they decided to sack me for the gross misconduct of questioning the requirement to teach gender identity on criminal law module. So those are the facts over which I now bring in an employment tribunal against the Open University. I'm saying that I was unfairly dismissed, that I was discriminated against for my gender critical beliefs, that I was dismissed for my belief in academic freedom, and that I was dismissed for exercising my right to academic free expression. So what is new about my case, and why do I say it's a test case that tries to develop the law on academic freedom? The most important sense in which we're trying to develop and clarify the law on academic freedom with my case is that we're asking the employment tribunal to confirm how academic freedom is already applied into the employment contract of every single academic, implied into their employment contract as a matter of human rights law. All that flows from Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the freedom of expression. Now, Helen has already reminded us that this is, of course, a qualified right, not an absolute right, so there can be restrictions on the freedom of speech, even on campus. But, and this is the big but, this is the academic freedom but, there is a body of case law from the European Court of Human Rights which says that academics doing their work must have the highest level of protection of free speech that anyone ever gets. Academics, along with journalists. And that's because of the role that the speech of academics and journalists plays in society, and the benefit to society more widely of academics being able to say what they know and what they think. So for that reason, Strasbourg Court has said there are very, very few circumstances under which human rights law will allow the interference with academic speech. That's already European human rights law, so in theory that already applies in the UK. I say in theory because university administrators seem now to politically resist to the fact that that is the law. The way human rights law operates is a bit too complex and indirect sentence for human rights, for human resource departments to follow it, to even understand that it's relevant for them. Because the way the Human Rights Act works is that for the most part, you just say that any law has to be read and given effect in a way that is compatible with people's human rights, including, therefore, with academics' very, very broad right to free speech that the Strasbourg Court has outlined. So that means that whenever university administrators are doing anything that in any way involves, for instance, employment law or equality law, they have to do so in a way which respects the very, very broad academic freedom of expression that the European Court of Human Rights has confirmed exists. And that is the bit that university HR departments by and large don't get at the moment. That's the bit that we're hoping the employment tribunal, in my case, will spell out in such a way that HR departments can't just keep ignoring it, and that hopefully also other sections of the university can't keep ignoring this. The reason why no English judge has spelled that out so far, as far as we can tell, is simply the fact that nobody's ever really tried to raise this case law on academic freedom of expression before the English court. So no English judge has ever had occasion or opportunity to explain what that means for things like English employment law. That Strasbourg Court has said academic freedom of expression has the highest level of protection that anybody's freedom of expression ever gets. And not just in the Forstater case, we're really hoping that once we put one test case before an employment tribunal, with a test case like mine, we will hopefully get that spelled out. So that is the main element of where we're trying to develop the law with my case. There's one other area in which we are proposing a new argument, and that is that we are arguing that believing in academic freedom and in the importance of academic freedom in itself.
Sorry, can I just ask, is this the South Central Liberal?
No, you need to be in a different room.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. I was just saying, so another new legal argument that we're introducing in my case is that we're saying that belief in the importance of academic freedom should in itself be a protected belief under the Equality Act. Forced data confirmed that gender critical beliefs are a philosophical belief are protected under the Equality Act. There have been previous cases that have, for instance, confirmed that a belief in man-made climate change is a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act, or that ethical veganism is a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act. So there's no logical reason really why believing in academic freedom shouldn't also be a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act. And that's the other area in which we're hoping to develop the law with my test case. Now, am I going to win? Are we going to succeed getting all of this established in law? I hope so. I can't guarantee it yet. We believe my case is strong, but it's a mug's game trying to predict the outcome of any legal case.
Nobody can ever give you a cast iron guarantee for the outcome of any court case. But even if I didn't win on all the points, some other academic probably would come not too far behind me, running quite a similar argument in probably not vastly similar circumstances. Because if there's one thing we've got no shortage of at the moment, it's academics whose academic freedom has been violated by their university. And until that changes, we will have a steady supply of potential test cases coming down the pipeline. So it's not ideal. Like Helen, I wish HEFOSA had come into force to reduce the number of violations of academic freedom that we're seeing at the moment. But I am quite confident that we will get stronger protections for academic freedom one way or another in the medium term. And that'll be thanks to the courts, it'll be thanks to strategic litigation. Dare I say, it will be thanks to crowdfunding of the donors who've made that strategic litigation possible to do so. Already else the nail in the coffin of enforceable academic freedom. My answer to that is watch this space. Time will tell us.
Go through these processes, and I just think it's awful that when we have this body of law, neither the state nor the agencies that are supposed to assist have been, enforcing that space for people's freedom of expression and freedom of belief. And I think we will look back on this in years to come and say that this scandal ranked alongside those other ones that I was mentioning earlier. So just before I go on to Lara, can I just ask you, I mean, they sacked you, and then you have to take a constructive dismissal or what?
It wasn't actually. It is an unfair dismissal.
Unfair dismissal case. So what made you determined to do that? Because in a sense, one could perfectly understand why you said, I don't need that grief. Why did you say to yourself, I've got to do this?
Why did I keep questioning?
Why did you take the unfair dismissal case?
Why did I take the unfair dismissal case? Well, you just don't want them to get away with it.
Yeah.
Quite frankly,
Good answer.
that if they get away with doing it to me, they will keep doing it to other people. Anybody who's read the judgment in Phoenix versus Open University will read that the judges came to the conclusion that what mainly motivated the leadership of the Open University was fear. Fear of the gender activists within the university's own rank. It wasn't that they believed it was the right thing the tribunal found. It was that the leaders of the Open Universities were motivated by fear. And quite frankly, we have to up the ante on the other side, and we have to keep pushing back. We cannot let the leadership of the Open University violate people's fundamental rights because they are too scared to stand up to their trans activists. Yeah.
Well done. And finally, we have Lara Favaro, who already spoke to us last year at the Fringe meeting in Bournemouth. Lara is a Spanish sociologist who was invited by City University, located in Clerkenwell. And it saddens me greatly that City University did this to you, because I had the honour of being a ward councillor for Clerkenwell through the 90s. And City University was on my patch, so I feel personal hurt that City University have been so awful. Anyway, City University invited Lara to move to the UK in 2020 as a postdoctoral research fellow in their Gender and Sexualities Research Centre to conduct a sociological inquiry into the, quote, gender wars. And as she was researching discrimination against female academics who raised questions about gender identity theory, she found herself subjected to false complaints, had her research stopped, her research data taken away from her, and lost her job. She's now settled her case with the university, and I think she wants to maybe to talk about that, but also to talk about the research that she's carrying out on now, and basically where that has got you to in your life and career.
Thank you. So how are we doing with them? Do I need to get?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I'm gonna have to bring you forward.
Maybe around the side, Alison, maybe. Move it 90 degrees.
Oh, I've always been this side.
Oh, that's clever. Lateral thinking.
So how's this?
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
great, fantastic. Yes, thank you. Rather than talking about my story, what I want to do today is report on the experiences of many other academics, in particular, especially women, by talking about the findings of the research project I conducted a couple of years ago that you just described. Apologies for those of you that are familiar with the material already. Right, so before I discuss gender studies in particular, I would like to note that experiences of censorship in British academia is a much broader problem, as we have been alluding to already. In my project, I collected different types of data, and this included a survey of hundreds of academics across the social sciences who mentioned self-censoring on a range of issues beyond sex and gender due to fears of negative repercussions. This includes politics, religion, race or ethnicity, mental health and disability. Named a couple of times were Brexit, the COVID pandemic, China, Palestine and Israel. Survey respondents also reported to be self-censoring on issues that could upset students or attract complaints. And they were remaining silent about their critical views on higher education management, as well as working life in the sector, including in relation to exploitation and bullying. So there is a real problem in British higher education. However, nothing compares to the toxic climate that has been created by the sex denialist and pro-gender movement that I now call genderism. And let me support this statement with evidence. I also conducted 50 interviews with academics in gender studies holding different views on sex and gender. These were mainly senior scholars, and it included journal editors and editorial board members at 14 relevant academic journals. The title of our event today, Can We Talk?, reflects what I did here. First, in terms of inviting over 100 academics to take part in an interview with me. Many genderist academics refused to take part. And note that at the time I was taking a neutral position as I was collecting data. For example, one considered that an open sociological study was unacceptable, arguing that this topic should only be approached from a trans advocacy perspective. Another was critical of the fact that I was including the views of feminists. That is, and here I will define it very briefly, as I understand feminism. So those who believe that sex is a biological reality and use the word gender to refer to those cultural stereotypes and norms that operate to oppress women. So of course, feminists are critical of gender. In the interviews, I would ask questions like, can we have open discussions around sex and gender at universities? Would you allow a gender critical or a feminist academic to talk in your seminar or to publish in your journal? And these are some of the responses I got from academics supportive of genderism. Universities are not democratic spaces. It is a matter of politics, not of scholarly elucidation, later clarifying that it is not about intellectual lines first, but political lines first. Another said, these gender critical feminists, they are intellectualizing, and I think it's harmful. The current persecution of feminists at universities was located as part of, quote, a political battle over an institutional space, in rebellion against the ideals of the Enlightenment and the principles of debate and civility. Rather, I was told, truthfulness is the outcome of political struggle. Think transgender women or women. I had no trouble excluding them, told me a journal editor with reference to the aggressive physical removal of two feminists from an event at a London university. Regarding having discussions, I was told, I would feel the same about sitting down at the table with a hardcore racist or fascist. Systematically, this strong condemnation was coupled with a striking ignorance about the actual views and concerns of feminists. For example, a sociologist said, I don't know if what I understand or what I think are the issues. I'll be honest with you, I stay out of their way. What I found is that part of the genderist no-debate policy is a refusal to even read outside of what they described as their echo chamber, where there is an expectation to, quote, be there for your team and toe the party line. Meanwhile, those feminists who had publicly voiced their views had suffered all sorts of repercussions, which includes, but is not limited to, being ostracized, no platformed, complaints to the workplace, abuse online, threats of violence, and physical intimidation. Then there was those who were too afraid to speak. I want to highlight here that this not only includes those supportive of a feminist position, but also those who simply wanted there to be discussions and had some concerns or wanted to raise questions around genderism, in particular as regards children. These women felt anxious, depressed, alienated. They told me, we are all so afraid. Also repeatedly, I don't feel safe. Even those who described their views as middle ground explained how it is a particular sort of trans politics that has become so influential and which has cowed so many into submission. Another said, the hegemony on the gender affirmative side produces actual material effects on people's careers. And she went on to note that this hegemony, quote, gets enforced in extremely violent ways. You see what happens to other people, these female academics would tell me. As a result, they are afraid to open their mouths, as they put it. Another self-preservation strategy was to withdraw altogether from research and teaching on gender. Others were talking students out of doing gender-critical projects. Still others were acceding to the commands of the doctrine, for example, putting pronouns in their email signatures or using the ideological language. One told me the following about her writing. Cisgender is one of these things that we now have to add. It was also out of anxiety. Men, women, and non-binary people, you have to say that. It's something that happens without a debate. Another academic with views in the middle, who had stepped down from her role as the journal editor, she told me, I don't want to be associated with scholarship that is thought police. In terms of the feminists who remained silent, they still shared experiences of attempts to curtail their academic freedom. This includes requests in their publications and teaching to change references from sex to gender and to discuss transgender, even when this wasn't relevant. In closing, I want to draw your attention to two subgroups. First, those in the earlier stages of their careers, who remained silent because they considered that their careers would not survive the expected backlash, which would include a loss of networks, which are so essential networks. The second group is those who mentioned concerns over putting their children at risk if they spoke up. For example, after noting the death and rape threats by transgender activists and their allies that are so common online, one feminist interviewee told me, "I have children, I'm frightened." And now I am going to finish with a longer quote from an academic who described her views as somewhere in the middle. "I don't feel safe. It makes me feel so emotional," and she collapsed it. "I came to academia because I wanted to. I don't know why I'm crying right now, but it feels so alienating because it should be about discussing and exchanging ideas, and it's not. It's not in our context. And it's not just alienating, it's also incredibly anxiety-provoking because I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to put my kids at risk. I know they could be put at risk. And I don't have any extreme views at all."
Thank you very much, Lara. I mean, I think you've given us a chilling flavour of what's happening, and it's, I mean, how can you live in a liberal society when so many people are oppressed by fear? I mean, this is the antithesis of liberalism, and I think that's why we have liberal voice for women, because we are determined that our own party should practice, you know, not only the laws that exist, but also the famous preamble to our own constitution that most of us can quote. You know, no one should be oppressed by poverty, ignorance, or conformity. That is great. And, you know, I mean, what is the point if we are oppressed by conformity? And presumably you're well, I shouldn't put that words in your mouth, but you chose to take a stand at City University. What motivated you to do that rather than to sort of go quietly?
Right. Yeah, in terms of taking legal action, I suppose it was first the feeling that I had gone through too much and I had exhausted all my options. And I must note that this includes being supported by a free speech union. I'm very thankful to them. I was feeling desperate, traumatized. It was evident that I needed more help. And I suppose why I was, towards the end, I was facing the loss of my data and the loss of my job. It was not an easy decision because it meant going public. I'm sure Almut knows what I'm. And relying on crowdfunding, which is very scary. And I'm so grateful to everyone who donated. Can I take this?
Well, thank you very much for your courage. Right, well, we now do turn to questions on the floor, including online. And we have about 25 minutes or so. I'm afraid I personally need to go rather abruptly about 9:40 because I'm scooting off back to London on the train. So I think Zoe is going to do the honours in terms of the microphone. So,
I am, yes. I'm proud. And Alison's going to ask the ones online, but I'm going to take this advantage to ask the first question, if that's okay. So what does the panel have to say about those who say free speech on social media, etc., is enabling and empowering populist movements and politicians?
Well, I think all three of us on the panel actually have connection to South America, which is a continent that throughout the 20th century has had populist movements and politicians getting up to all sorts of nasty things. And of course, that was an age before there was social media, so I see no connection between populist politicians being able to operate and social media.
I'd add that when you bottle things up, like, you know, I was working at The Economist on the Britain section. If anyone is old enough, like me, I think some of us are, to remember the famous open mic thing that happened during the election in which Gordon Brown was standing, and this woman said something about immigration, and he turned and he said, "That bigoted woman." And I remember thinking, gosh, that's hilarious. I don't quite remember what I thought, but I didn't register, actually. That was 2010, yeah. That was when Brexit happened. I should have realised that there was something that people were talking about that was not being talked about in the press, that was not being talked about in academia, that was not being talked about in any of the sense-making institutions. Did it go away? No, it did not go away, just because we were not talking about it. And then we were all astonished when Brexit happened because we hadn't known it was being talked about. And I've become really so obsessed by this thing that there's all these things that people are talking about and thinking about that are not making it into the BBC, that are not making it into the Guardian. It's really bad in Ireland at the moment, like RTE and the Irish Times are not talking about things that really people are talking about on the streets about immigration. And this has nothing to do with whether you agree or disagree. That's not what I'm talking about. People get very angry when they think that they're seeing something happening, that there's a silence in a code of omerta about it. And that causes populist revolts. I think we've got to talk about these things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I have anything to add. I suppose building on what you just said, Helen, perhaps this is a cop-out kind of answer, because I'm thinking, well, I have to specify what it is that we're talking about, because if there's one thing we've witnessed in the last few years is the emptying of meaning of words, right? So now, suppose I'm a little bit more cynical than I used to be before, and I would want to say, okay, show me what exactly is it that you're describing and referring to, and how are you using discursively this term? What work is it doing?
Populism.
Yeah. So, yeah.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Right. Okay. Hands up, please, people. And it's just one question per person. No follow up unless there's time to go around afterwards. So. Okay, Talia, I'll come back to you.
Hello, thanks so much. That was fascinating. If your case is successful, what difference will it make in academia? Do you think? Because it feels like there's a vice-like grip, not just in academia, but and I just wonder how you think that's going to, or what you think the steps will be that will change things, because it just frightens me when you start looking and seeing how it's just everywhere. It feels like everything's stitched in so many ways to sort of stop just being able to talk freely, whatever, and schools, right back down to that level. So yeah, that's my question.
I think it is directed to Almut.
What difference will it make in academia? Well, it would have the advantage that the law, your rights to academic freedom and expression that you have as an employee of the university will be spelled out in very clear terms, hopefully, by the employment tribunal. So I cannot promise you that the university will honour it. They will certainly be a lot more aware of it, or it will be a lot easier to draw their attention to it by hopefully quoting sections from an employment tribunal decision that says, okay, this is what English employment law is in relation to an academic's right to academic freedom expression. And I'm asking you to respect what an employment tribunal has confirmed are my rights as an employee.
So I think one of the things that question is, it's a question about theory of change. And it's just not the case that if you say that something is a legal right, that suddenly we all have that right. Like those of us who aren't lawyers like me tend to think that. And now I work with lawyers all the time and they just roll their eyes. Well, that's not lawful. No, yes, it isn't. What are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. Mostly nothing. So, but if you look back over the last few years since Maya won her case, it is not the case that employers all around the country are respecting people's rights to be sex realists. They absolutely aren't. But they're a lot more scared than they were. There's a lot more people speaking than they were. I tend to like analogies from gardening. And if you think of the way that weeds or grass spread over the years, like the roots hold things together, you know, the roots form soil, and then over time there's less erosion, and then there's more soil, and over time it just builds. But you could never say that it was one thing that did it, or that, you know, one law or one event made it happen. It just kind of coalesces. So yeah, if that analogy didn't work, sorry about that. I was trying my best. It's very clear up here.
No, it's very good. Lara, do you want to come in on that one, or wait for another question?
Next question, then, please. Okay, I'll come to John first, and then I'll come over to you. So.
Hi, thanks for the talks. I should say I'm John Python, the convener of the Open University Gender Critical Research Network, and I've recently settled a case with the Open University. So this isn't a particularly controversial question. I just want your reflections. There seems to me to be two things going on here, and I wonder about the balance between the two. And one is a very specific attack on the issue of sex and gender about intellectual inquiry run by trans rights activists in universities, that is an attack particularly on feminist academics. And the other is a sort of stultifying conformity in universities that stops people arguing positions that I don't agree with on Brexit, on critical race theory, on a whole range of issues. And there's a kind of general conformism and stultifying academic atmosphere and intellectual atmosphere. I just wondered what your views were on the balance between those two in contributing to the situation that we're in.
Who wants to pick that one up first? Lara, do you want to go on that one?
Yeah, I suppose something that we haven't discussed is, you know, how did we get here? So, I mean, I do think, I mean, my latest work has been around the effects of queer theory beyond the study of gender. And so in terms of the balance, I do see a relationship in the sense that there are some views or perspectives that are favoured in academia at the moment. And I think it's in part related to, you know, this thirst for finding the most niche and novel topics. I think queer theory facilitates that, because it's about always breaking rules. Obviously, there will always be a rule to break and norm to contest. So it's like a never-ending sort of game that makes you feel, you know, makes scholars feel like they're being very innovative and rebellious and sophisticated, because no one understands what they're talking about. So, and then of course we have the, you know, privatization, you know, the fact that they're being run like companies, and we're so reliant on student fees, and therefore there's that fear of the student discomfort with facing views that are different to the ones they're already holding, right? And yeah, I don't think I've really answered your question. I'm just giving you thoughts, random thoughts.
Who next?
I mean, I agree with all of that, especially the students as customers. You know, it's just not possible. It's just not possible that Pips and Andrew, who are in their 50s, seriously believe any of this nonsense. They can't possibly. But their students cause them endless trouble if they don't go along with it. And these words of diverse and inclusive and welcoming and supportive and harm reduction and so on, you know, they're all very much tailored to what the students think they want, or what grown-ups think the students think they want. But I would also say that, you know, free speech is never popular. Academic freedom is never popular. It's the eternally radical idea. People think, it's like markets. You know, you think, oh, well, if the government intervenes and rescues this company, it'll be a good thing. Because it's a good company, all those people will lose their jobs. Like, think of that factory closing. It's really hard to argue Schumpeterian creative destruction. And free speech is like that. Like, if you think you know the answer to a problem, it's quite tempting to impose it if you're in a position to do so. But you just have to have faith that actually this process over time works. So when people think they can get away with not having free speech, they tend not to. And then the last thing I'd say, again, is just kind of a reflection around it. You know, the academic, the mood of the times for some decades now has been that words are enormously important and powerful, and that we can make reality with words. And if there's something bad like racism or homophobia or sexism, that we can fix it by fixing the words. And that means that you have to really silence people who say something you don't like. I mean, if there are men who want to be women and they say they're women and that makes them women, and you say, well, actually, you know, they're still men, then you have just broken everything by saying something. And that wasn't the way we thought, I think, until relatively recently. We just didn't give words that enormous power to create reality. But that makes you enormously censorious if you do that.
Yeah, I think so. That ties in with what I was saying, I suppose, how it's structuring these ideas, which of course are what then influence queer theory, which is this even more extreme, I would say, set of ideas. But indeed, it's almost to be a realist or to do kind of empirical work or positivist. You know, positivism is almost like an insult in academic circles, right? It's all discourse and, you know, social construction and the like. And yeah, they're becoming indoctrination camps because of this idea, right? We can change the world through our words. Yes.
Nasty ideologies don't normally take hold of institutions because the vast majority of people in the institution believe in these ideologies. It is almost invariably, in my opinion, because a few people believe in it, and underneath that you get a large layer of people who know that that is the way to further your career, because that particular ideology is connected with power at that time, and if you're actually into your intuitive, you will go further in your institution than without it. Now, that bulk of support for that nasty ideology drops away the minute it starts being conducive to your career to support it. So I'm actually a lot more optimistic than a lot of other gender political feminists about the fact that I think a point will come where all of this just crumbles, and where the trans believers go back to being a tiny group of people who haven't got any powers, and power only have suddenly lost the vast support that they had, and that will be the moment that it's no longer in the interest of the careerists and opportunities to support trans ideology.
I hope you're right. I can see how that might happen. What worries me is the deep roots that it has taken so many institutions, government departments, NHS, schools, Quality and Human Rights Commission.
Stop. I was enjoying myself. It will be like down.
But it can still crumble, and some of it has to be done from the top. I mean, I'm waiting to see whether West Streeting is going to do anything about the health service. Yeah. Clearly, Bridget Phillipson is not there, because West Streeting have been fairly brave. But I don't know. That's the problem with the Labour Party. They kind of get you you want a non-Tory government, and then you remember what the Labour Party has been like for decades. Anyway, I digress. Where's the next question?
We've got a question from online listeners. Caroline says, I'm a working class lesbian who did my masters with the OU before they went insane. I live in a very working class area where the gender nonsense is given short shrift. I know many local women who have done short courses and degrees with the OU, and having had a shit time at school, it's changed their lives. Is there any awareness in the OU management that they've literally thrown their core purpose under the bus? Any at all?
What an excellent question. Yeah.
And she says she's really loved to do a PhD, but can't as the OU is now.
I think there's certainly a great deal of awareness of that among the rank and file at the university. I don't know whether John would agree with that or not. As for the upper echelons, I'm not sure they care. I have seen nothing from the top leadership of the Open University that suggests to me that they are genuinely concerned with the Open University's founding vision of being open to people, places, methods, and ideas.
I can say something about that. One of the strange things that happens when you introduce a lie into a system of thought, and not just a mistake, an actual back to front lie, like a 1 = 0 thing, is it breaks over time, it breaks systems, and it breaks them at their point of mission. So you get the Office for National Statistics, like it isn't that the Office for National Statistics messed up on safeguarding or messed up on some random thing. It started to screw up its data collection. I mean, you may have seen in the last day or two, they've had to admit that for the first time they asked a question on the census that was nonsense and produced nonsense data. And so it's no surprise to me, because I've seen this happen again and again, that the Open University very specifically is screwing up on its specific mission. Because if you allow a lie in, that's where it breaks.
No, just to add what I think we all know that this is it comes from such a place of privilege. Yes, these ideologies. And they're so distant, so detached from material realities, not just the body, but certainly poverty, working class lives. Absolutely. If you only you could identify yourself as rich.
Yeah. I mean, that case for me is absolutely no thought to the kind of women who are in prisons, who are mainly vulnerable for all kinds of reasons in their lives, and often will have suffered domestic and sexual abuse. And they're the population of women who got told that they must accept male-bodied people who identified as women in their prisons. And absolutely no thought was given to their welfare. And, just dumping on poor, vulnerable, at-risk women. It would once have been inconceivable. In the name of an ideology, and because of the fear of challenging that ideology, they are the fall guys for a sense of entitlement that has imposed itself, and that makes me very angry. Anyway, next question.
Yes, thanks. I remember when I was a student in the 80s, university faculty would cover a range of opinions. You'd be taught by conservatives, Marxists, etc., etc. My perception is now that the people running and teaching in universities are the sort of people who are in charge, the sort of people who were voting for no platform policies back in the 80s. And therefore that there is a raft of people that are now in charge that never really believed in free speech at all, and the conservative faculty have retired and been replaced by almost a uniform opinion, generic opinion. Is that part of the problem?
I think the way that universities work now is they self-replicate. I mean, that's always a difficulty in any profession, but academics hire academics, and the way that you have your academic board think a particular candidate is a particularly good candidate is that candidate reflects back to them their own positions and does work that is based on their work and so on. So I really do think that academia is more conformist, much more conformist. I bet you if you walked into a factory and went over to the machine workers and asked them for their opinions on, say, 10 things, Brexit, I don't know, just list 10 things, you'd get more variety of opinion. And I mean, I think the academics would say that's because some of it was stupid, but I mean, the stupid things I've heard from academics.
This is disillusioning, this discussion, it has to be said. One thought of academia as a pinnacle of free expression and free thought. And if you thought that this evening's bringing us down to earth. Is that Juliet?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, let's try and pick things up and be a bit more positive then. So what needs to happen for the government to shift and for them to do what they need to do with this bill that was about to become a law that they're kind of shelved? What can the Lib Dems do?
I think what we've got to do is we've got to create a lot of free speech. Like what Arif and I said is either we'd be able to hold this event and it would go really well and that would show something, or there'd be a lot of protests and that would show something. We shouldn't be waiting for these opportunities to come along. We should be specifically saying, who's going to invite the Israeli ambassador to come and talk? Who's going to get a gender critical woman to come and talk? Who's going to get someone to come and talk about how we should never have Brexited and someone else to talk about how Brexit was great? Get these things to happen and, either it'll turn out we didn't need this bill because our universities are bastions of free speech, or we'll start getting coverage for this. Because the one thing that I've heard cut through in the DFE was those Nobel Prize winners saying this is a bad idea. I think it's about press. Mm-hmm. I would think that I'm a journalist.
And whilst I understand it perfectly, they deserve to retire, and these are the people that would be the hope for people like myself, and I want to be able to return to academia. So
we're going to just take one last question.
Can I just say something hopeful about academia, though? I mean, I think that people are starting to say they're going to organise conferences and starting to do events and so on. I mean, Aqua Reindorf, who did the Reindorf Review, has been given a visiting fellowship at, I think, LSE. And there are a few other examples like that. I think we're starting to see that bit where, you're going to look pretty damn good in 5 years' time if this is what you were doing.
My question was actually going to follow on from that quite nicely. I was running a student society at LSE a few years ago, and we did exactly what you said in terms of putting on as many events from both perspectives, all perspectives. And we went through the hoops of bureaucracy and security and whatever, and that turned out fine. My question is, though, what's the best way to respond to the arguments that the other side often present? We try and be factual, we try and be sensible about things, but they pull out the unoffended card. Should we also play that game in the future? Should we say we're also offended? I mean, I think I remember Jordan Peterson once on Channel 4 pulled that card, and he played it quite well when the interviewer pushed him on that, and he said, well, you offended me by asking that question yourself. So is that something we should consider, or what's the best solution there?
I would say don't stoop to their level. You keep the moral high ground, or in the case of academia, keep the intellectual high ground.
I mean, I guess it depends what sort of person you are. I find it very hard to answer that because I've almost never been on a platform with somebody who disagrees with me because they refuse. Almost but when they do, what they say is so damn stupid. And that's not because I'm some sort of genius, it's because it's just nonsense. So I've come to the conclusion that what I say makes me win and what they say makes me win. So I don't need to be doing anything particularly clever. I just need to get them to speak. When your enemy is making mistakes, don't interrupt them.
I'm just thinking, which is what I did with my research, right? Yes.
Just let them speak.
Yeah.
Let them speak.
Marcus asked for one last question. It is the last question. Go on, Mark.
Very, very short. Helen, you said, I think I got this right, when you introduce a lie into an institution, it breaks the system. Could that apply to a political party too?
It applies to any complex system where something that happens in one place has implications in another place. So my PhD was in mathematics, and the example that I use is, suppose you said that just right over in that corner there, a teeny little equation you'd allow 1 to be 0. Well, you may remember from primary school that you can add the same thing on both sides of an equation and you still get a true equation, or divide both sides and multiply both sides. As long as you do the same thing on both sides, you still have a true equation. Well, if 1 equals 0, then you can add 1 to one side and 0 to the other side and put another false equation. Every equation is false because that equation is false. And at first you don't notice because you haven't done it, you haven't done the sums, but over time that lie propagates through the whole system. And legal systems are less structured than mathematics, but they are still structured. So when you introduce a lie, like that a man can be a woman, you can write a birth certificate saying that a male person is female. It took a while before we noticed, but now it's breaking safeguarding, education, policing, prison system, healthcare, education, all over the place, and because one is zero in so many places. Well, of course it can break a political party because you have a founding mission and people act in accordance to it. But if you bring a lie in, it will break things.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, I'm going to hand over. Good question. Before Alison will say a few words.
Yeah, I mean, I think what motivates Liberal Voice for Women, if I can speak for organisations, but my personal commitment to it is first of all about the cause of being able to speak freely about sex and gender, but also the soul of the party. Anyway, sorry, I get a little bit. This party can't fight to be a Liberal party. Yeah. So, anyway, it's been an absolutely brilliant fringe meeting, and we're very, very thankful to Helen, Almut, and Lara for finding the way to Brighton which was such a horrid show. I know. On such a sunny day, couldn't be pouring with rain. To give us the benefit of your thoughts, very stimulating discussion. And I thank everybody who's attended. Very decent attendance, if I may say so. And I think it encourages us to have more meetings, more activities. I can't say enough to thank Zoe and Julia and their colleagues. To do all the work, and I just sort of put my cherry on the cake. I mean, I rate my activities largely on Twitter. Isn't much of it. Little bit in the law.
Thank you, ladies. You've all been cherries on the top. Thank you very much. And thank you to our audience. I've been going around inviting people to come and disagree with us, and nobody has actually moved tonight. We haven't had questions from people who disagree. And maybe we'll talk to people later on who disagree profoundly with us, and we can try and get some dialogue going. We welcome dialogue at all times. But can I thank you? I know you've got to get the taxi now, and thank you all three of you, I guess, as well, who've taken so much time and trouble to come here and speak to us in Brighton. Thank you so much for having me.